35 Union Pacific train cars derailed near Texas town. This is obviously on top of the Norfolk Southern disaster.
This is not a safe environment. A safe environment is one where people are well rested, where morale is high, where routine is the order of the day, not where everything is in a state of chaos, where workers are constantly fatigued and totally demoralized by what used to be a relatively fluid railroad now becoming a parking lot.
Hey, it's Jordan with Status Coup.
This is Ashley with Status Coup.
On the ground.
In Philadelphia.
Flint, Michigan. East Palestine, Ohio. Please support the leading independent news outlet on the ground.
Covering what the corporate media covers up.
Hey, it's Jordan. I am very happy to be joined by Ron Kamenkow. You're the co-founder, Rail Workers United, longtime railman, brakeman, conductor, engineer, Conrail, Norfolk Southern, Amtrak, among others. And I think it's important we talk. There's a lot of crises and stories flying around on a whole lot of things in America. But I think the monopolization of many industries is a crisis. And we might have more of that consolidation if certain railroad giants get their way. Can you tell us about the merger being proposed that could bring down the class 1 railroad operators, already a shrinking number? It could consolidate it even further.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Over the course of the 20th century, we had a couple hundred class 1 railroads in this country about 100 years ago, and that shrunk to about 40 by 1980. And then when I hired out on the railroad in the mid 1990s, about 30 years ago, we were pretty much down to getting close to the number that we have today. I think there was maybe 9. Union Pacific and Southern Pacific and Chicago Northwestern had just merged at that point. Burlington Northern and Santa Fe were in the process of merging. And then other smaller railroads were gobbled up by Canadian National, Canadian Pacific, and so forth. And so we ended up with 7. The most recent merger last year was consummated between Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern. So we're down to 6. If Norfolk Southern and Union Pacific have their way, it will be the biggest rail merger in the history of the United States, most likely the most complex merger in the history of North America. And it will mean that we are now down to, in effect, 5 railroads. And in doing so, one can expect that the rivals, Burlington Northern, Santa Fe in the west, CSX in the east, will by default merge. And then we will have 4 class 1 railroads that control the entirety of North America, Canada, Mexico, and the United States, 90% of rail movement in the continent.
So people understand, if it's consolidated down even further, I mean, we already know about the limited staffing, cutting corners, but this would also have an impact on actual product that we transport all over the country if you only have so many, mega railroads.
Yeah, I mean, the so-called robber barons of the 19th and early 20th century, the great railroad tycoons, if you will, James J. Hill, the empire builder, Jay Gould, Harriman, Vanderbilt. Most Americans are familiar with these names, and they were what was known as the robber barons. And the term railroaded came out of this whole thing. And industry, as well as labor, small communities and large, were not happy with the railroad industry because of this consolidation and concentration of wealth and power. They had an inordinate effect on the nation's economy and local economies' strength and health and vitality. And so we ended up regulating the railroads. And what's happening today, those robber barons could only dream of. They never even came close to the consolidation that we're now witnessing. And we have to ask ourselves, is this what we want? And historically, the American people have been very, very much opposed to monopoly. There's a board game called Monopoly that we all have played and we're all familiar with, and that was produced with the understanding that this is a scourge upon society, having such concentration of power and wealth. And here we are, green lighting it and saying, oh, this is the interest of business. And what's in the interest of business, of course, the mythology is that's in the interest of all of the American people, including the working class. And I don't think history really bears that out. But unfortunately, this merger is going full steam ahead. And if we are not capable of thwarting it, it will be consummated sometime in the next year.
As we're speaking now, there was a massive derailment down in Texas. 35 Union Pacific train cars derailed near Texas town. Fortunately, no injuries. This is obviously on top of the Norfolk Southern disaster detonation that we've covered extensively for 2 years. So obviously, as things stand now, there's pretty serious safety issues in the railroad industry. There has not really been any real movement on major safety legislation. But if Union Pacific and Norfolk merge, what impact would that have on safety conditions, upgrading equipment? We know a lot of these rail lines still have brake systems from previous centuries. What about the safety?
Well, I think there's a number of things at play, Jordan. The first is there's a propensity in these large mergers of recent decades to result in what's commonly known as meltdowns. And so huge service failures took place in 95, 96 when Union Pacific gobbled up the Southern Pacific. They simply were not capable of integrating the two big railroads, and shippers suffered greatly. A lot of traffic was diverted to other railroads onto the nation's highways. And I would speculate a number of weaker industrial firms simply went out of business because they could not meet the demand of their customers, etc. None of this is properly documented. Shortly after the Union Pacific merger in 1999, I was employed by a railroad called Conrail. It was carved in half. And the half that I was working for as an engineer went to Norfolk Southern. And on day one, June 1st, 1999, it was a huge meltdown. They lost every car in the entire combined system. And it took us about 18 months to dig ourselves out of this hole. My record was being called for duty to recrew a train whose previous crew had expired on the hours of service law. I recruited that train at Coalower, Indiana at milepost 510. I took that train 1 mile to CP 509 at the bridge over the Calumet River. In 12 hours, we moved that freight train 1 mile. This was not uncommon during that meltdown that lasted for months and months and months. So these service failures, they jam up the railroad. Everything is a crisis. Every day you go to work, workers are being worked to the bone because we're short-staffed, because the railroad is no longer fluid. Trains are waiting to get into yards. Trains are stalled out and tied down on the main line, et cetera, et cetera. And so in a context of mass confusion, fatigue, and what I would call constipation of the railroad, there is a huge impetus for management to rush things up, to cut corners. And this is just a fact of life. We got to get this train out of the yard. We need to get this power inspected and on that train headed to Jersey. And you get the idea. This is not a safe environment. A safe environment is one where people are well rested, where morale is high, where routine is the order of the day, not where everything is in a state of chaos, where workers are constantly fatigued and totally demoralized by what used to be a relatively fluid railroad, now becoming a parking lot. So that's the initial danger, specifically to railroad workers, our safety and our working conditions. But I would add more that when the railroad, if it does have this meltdown and get through the meltdown, the reason that corporations want to merge is they gain certain economies, and one of them is eradicating themselves of what they might call redundant or duplicate resources. So these two railroads are going to meet at New Orleans, Memphis, St. Louis, Kansas City, Chicago, and other smaller terminals. Both railroads, no doubt, have car shops, diesel shops, classification yards, etc., various infrastructure in all of those terminals. The idea will be to consolidate, downgrade, and or shutter or completely abandon, eliminate, and bulldoze one or the other facility. And in doing this, the idea is to downsize the workforce and to gain the economies of scale of just having one large yard instead of two smaller ones. So you get the picture. In this context, we're looking at fewer and fewer workers, and that cannot bode well for rail labor and the railroad workforce. And then last but not least, what we've already talked about, allowing corporations to have so much wealth and so much power is a perversion of American democracy, because they will lobby and be successful, no doubt, of pushing for a reduction in regulation. So long-standing Federal Railroad Administration regulations that have regulated the railroad under the Department of Transportation for decades. The rail industry's been lobbying for years to get rid of so many of them. This will only increase their ability to influence Congress, to influence the White House, and to influence regulatory agencies to dance to their tune, which is to say, you know, cut red tape and regulation, allow us to run our railroad the way we see fit. And for any railroad worker out there who's been on the property for any length of time, we know that they cannot be trusted with our health and safety and our lives.
Also, if we know from years ago under President Biden, there is federal law that allows the government to basically block railroad workers from going on strike, you know, citing the economy and whatever emergency powers they cite. But I take it if we're going down to even less class one railroad operators, that's even worse for labor. You already barely have the right to strike as a railroad worker. The federal government could block you, but the government would have even more reason or excuse to block labor from going on strike if there's less and less operators.
Well, exactly. And the devil's in the details in terms of exactly how it will manifest. But like I say, with Union Pacific, if they successfully merge with Norfolk Southern, it pretty much leaves the other two big railroads in this country, the BNSF in the West and CSX in the East, no alternative but to merge. And then we're left with two major railroads that are US based, moving 90% of the rail freight on the continent. And imagine if J.B. Hunt, a trucking company, and Schneider, two big trucking companies in this country, controlled that degree of market share of highway freight movements. We would be appalled and frightened by the prospect. But not only, to make the analogy further, would J.B. Hunt and Schneider control 90% of the trucking in this country, they would also control the interstate highway system. Because that's what we're looking at here. The rail industry in this country, which is much different than most railroads everywhere else in the world, and definitely different than any other of our transportation infrastructure. For example, the waterways, the Missouri, the Ohio, the Mississippi, these are all publicly owned. The locks and dams are maintained by the Army Corps of Engineers, federally funded. The interstate highway system was built, owned, and maintained by the federal government. And we could go on and on about our transportation infrastructure that is publicly owned and run in the public interest. But the railroad industry owns its own infrastructure. And so what we would see is two ginormous Fortune 500 corporations controlling and owning all the freight rail transportation infrastructure of this country. And I don't think that's anything closely resembling what the founding fathers of this country would want. And until recently, it wasn't something that would be condoned by either political party. And I would hazard a guess upwards of 90% of the American people don't like the idea of this kind of monopoly power being vested in such a small number of powerful corporations.
We should also add that the Wall Street mega banks are also heavily invested in these railroad companies, as is Vanguard, as we learned. Vanguard, I believe BlackRock own quite a lot of Norfolk Southern in particular. Let me ask you on those politicians after the East Palestine derailment, chemical detonation, which has been wiped away in the media. I talk to residents all the time. They're still sick. There was some talk of, bills trying to make laws to tighten regulation, et cetera, particularly how many staffers major railroad companies needed on board these mega trains, 150 cars. Nothing has passed. But can you kind of talk about, you said this is about a year away right now. What is the mood in Congress? My assumption is Republicans are totally on board with this. What is the Democratic Party saying about this possible merger, if anything at all?
Well, it's hard to say. I think at this point, most of our focus and attention is on other issues. Obviously, it's hard to get an issue such as this into the forefront of the news. The Congress will not vote on this. This is something that will go before the Surface Transportation Board, which is a commission of 5, I believe, at this point. And I think that might be 3 Republicans and now 2 Democrats. The Surface Transportation Board under the Biden administration was headed by Oberman. He retired just before the end of the Biden administration, and Robert Primus assumed the helm at Surface Transportation Board. Both of these gentlemen were relatively hostile to the antics of the Class 1 railroads in the last few years, particularly over their handling of Amtrak trains, and also their harsh treatment of many shippers. If you remember, Jordan, about 2-3 years ago, most of the shipping groups in this country that ship by rail were up in arms and were vocally speaking to the Surface Transportation Board. There was various hearings about the horrible service that they were getting. And so Oberman and Primus were very much hostile to the antics of the Class 1 railroads. Primus is still on the Surface Transportation Board, but I'm not sure the complexion of the rest of it. But they have signaled that they are ready to hear a merger application from Class 1 railroads once again. So the previous administration was probably not going to condone such a merger, but it looks like the current administration is open to the idea. But that brings up the question of the opposition, because everything's political. Can we sway the Surface Transportation Board to oppose this merger, or even sway Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern to withdraw their soon-to-be submitted petition to consummate the merger? I believe we can. There's a lot of opposition out there. The National Transportation Industrial League has come out swinging against this. It's one of the bigger shipper groups. I believe other shipper groups have voiced similar concerns. About half of rail labor has expressed their either outright opposition or deep concerns. Passenger rail advocacy groups and others, and of course Railroad Workers United last week came out swinging with a resolution and a press release designed to educate the American people about the Class 1 railroads in this country and why this merger would not be a good idea. So it remains to be seen. It ain't over till it's over. And we expect the opposition to build and grow as more is learned about the detrimental effects that this merger would have.
Lastly, if you could kind of just boil it down, why should people beyond the railroad industry care about this? How would it affect regular Jane and Joe American if there was this concentration between a merger between Norfolk and Union Pacific?
Well, obviously, if you live in a community along the tracks, you have reason to be concerned. As most folks are aware now, partly through the work of Railroad Workers United. We've educated people as to what's going on with train length, and the average train length has jumped dramatically. It's not uncommon for trains to be 2 miles long or even 3 miles plus. These trains have a propensity to derail more often. When they do derail, the cataclysmic results are much greater. They also tend to block crossings more frequently. Just given their length, they don't fit between different highway railroad crossings. And so if there is a huge meltdown like I experienced in 1999 and like Union Pacific and Southern Pacific workers experienced a few years earlier, and there's every reason to believe that that's a distinct possibility, we will have stalled trains, blocked crossings throughout our neighborhoods and towns. So those folks obviously have deep concerns, or should have, about such a proposed merger. In terms of just the general economy, I don't think the Conrail carve-up did a whole lot to help the economy, at least not during those meltdown years. This merger, I would say, is probably 3 to 4 times larger than that carve-up of Conrail, and has the potential, since especially it'll be a coast-to-coast railroad operating in most of the lower 48 states, to really be a national cataclysmic event if they are not able to consummate the merger in a streamlined fashion. So there's immediate concern, or should be, from everybody, how this would contribute, obviously, to inflation, job loss, and possibly actually plunge the economy into a recession. So everyone should be concerned. And then once again, back to the political question, do we really want to have a society that basically is a plutocracy, which is to say ruled by the wealthy and powerful? As Bernie Sanders is fond of talking about, the oligarchy. And this just builds the oligarchy even more power and wealth in a more concentrated fashion. So I would speculate that it's not in the interest of all American people, particularly working class people.
Absolutely. Thank you for taking the time. We'll stay on this as it gets closer. Right now, there's time to stop it, so it's good that we're getting it on people's radar now. Ron Cow, co-founder of Railroad Workers United. Thanks again.
Thanks, Jordan.